Yo, what's going on? Mike from Mike Talk Sports. Kelvin Gastelum is back in the win column against Chris Curtis at UFC 287. What's next for Kelvin Gastelum in his career? So first off, breaking down this fight, man, was it nice to see Kelvin Gastelum out there and look really good regardless of who you thought won the fight, which I will tell you who I thought won this fight in a little bit. But breaking down this fight in the first round, man, Kelvin Gastelum really came back looking really good. It looked like 170-pound Kelvin Gastelum in there in terms of his movement in that karate style of blitzing from the southpaw, going from really being at outside range to blitzing on the inside with that right hand jab. He was so effective blitzing in with that right hand jab. And it really all started with the leg kicks, investing into those leg kicks against Chris Curtis, a guy who really comes from the Sean Strickland school of thought of, okay, we're just going to kind of bang with you inside box and we're not really going to check leg kicks. Kelvin Gastelum saw that significant hole in Chris Curtis's game going into this fight and said, I'm going to invest in these leg kicks early and really keep him on his toes when he's on the outside. So Chris Curtis really started anticipating those leg kicks from the outside, and Kelvin Gastelum did such a good job feinting those leg kicks into that left hand straight. And again, like I said, that really nice jab. Also, he was throwing with powerful, vicious intent. That's another thing that really popped out to you watching this Kelvin Gastelum fight in the first round and really throughout all of the rounds. Kelvin Gastelum really was carrying a lot of power in those shots, specifically on those hooks. Now, I honestly think Chris Curtis did get the better of Kelvin Gastelum in the second round. I thought it was extremely close. And again, of course, that headbutt, which caused Chris Curtis to hit the ground. And then Kelvin Gastelum has that big moment on the ground where he kind of took his back and back mount and just kind of smashed away with those hooks on the ground, which really did win him that round two. And then round three, Chris Curtis definitely won that round three pretty convincingly. Kelvin Gastelum didn't necessarily look gassed in this round, but Chris Curtis really started to get a feel for that boxing game, that inside boxing game, and really invested in those body shots. That's another really nice thing to see out of Kelvin Gastelum, be in a bit of a war when he's been so significantly injured and injury prone in the last couple of years, and to see Kelvin Gastelum come in there and not only win, but take a significant amount of damage, specifically to the body, was extremely impressive to watch out of him, and look honestly completely fine after the fight and not really be wincing in pain from those huge body shots that Chris Curtis was landing. All in all, to be completely honest, I do think Chris Curtis won this fight 2-1. I thought Chris Curtis was the better fighter in the second round on the feet. And then, of course, again, Kelvin Gastelum had that big moment on the ground. Nonetheless, this was an extremely tough and close fight, and I'm definitely not upset about Kelvin Gastelum taking this decision. I thought it was a very fair decision to give to Kelvin Gastelum, even though I personally would not have judged the fight in that way. But let's look at Kelvin Gastelum, a guy who's still only 31 years old. What is next for Kelvin Gastelum? Well, he's already fought Jack Hermansson, Robert Whittaker, Jared Cannonier, and of course Israel Adesanya in that very iconic fight that he had with the current champion. But I think Kelvin Gastelum pretty clearly still proved he's a top 15 middleweight on earth. He really talked about that mentality change he had going into this fight after the fight on the post-fight press conference, and Kelvin Gastelum really looks primed to make another run at middleweight. Do I think Kelvin Gastelum is ever going to become a middleweight champion? No, I don't, but I think he can be a staple of this division for the next couple of years, which last year or the year before, that future looked pretty bleak, even though, again, he's a pretty young guy. What's next for Kelvin Gastelum? I think it is pretty obvious what's next for Kelvin Gastelum. Why not fight a guy who you just fought with the same fight style, a guy who is in the corner for this Chris Curtis fight, and that is going to be Sean Strickland. I already alluded to it before, but this matchup, Kelvin Gastelum versus Chris Curtis, stylistically, it made for fireworks because Chris Curtis is a guy who likes to stand in the pocket. And of course, Kelvin Gastelum loves to stand and bang on the feet. Kelvin Gastelum does like to mix in that wrestling as well, but Chris Curtis and Sean Strickland are such good counter grapplers. They're very good with their takedown defense. So I would love to see Kelvin Gastelum go from Chris Curtis to Sean Strickland, basically the same fighter, just slightly better. In this fight, I would would favor Sean Strickland. Now, if it was a 5-round fight, I would favor Sean Strickland. If it was a 3-rounder, I very could see Kelvin Gastelum winning. Not that, again, I think Kelvin Gastelum would gas in a fight versus Sean Strickland. I just think that inside boxing game at some point would start to take over like it did in this fight in the 3rd round where Chris Curtis won it. I think Sean Strickland would be very patient in the first couple of rounds. I do think Kelvin Gastelum maybe wins round 1 and round 2 against Sean Strickland, which again could be very much enough to win him the fight if it was a 3-round fight. But in a 5-rounder, I just see Sean Strickland constantly digging those hooks into Kelvin Gastelum's body, and Kelvin Gastelum is going to end up gassing from those huge body shots he was eating. But in Kelvin Gastelum's defense, again, he really absorbed those strikes extremely effectively. So I would love to see Kelvin Gastelum against Sean Strickland. Let me know who you guys think won in this fight, Kelvin Gastelum against Chris Curtis, and let me know if you guys agree with me that the next fight to make with Kelvin Gastelum is Sean Strickland.